Welcome to another look at poetry through the heart of the poet. And I'm delighted to look at the poetry of Emily Dickinson, and particularly when we get to it, The Wind Begun to Rock the Grass. But before I get to Emily, I'd like to put Emily into a little bit of a context. She reminds me of many poets. And one of them is one of my favorite contemporary poets, Mary Oliver, who died just a few years ago. And Mary Oliver says this, that attention is a form of devotion. And attention is what the poet pays to the world. And Emily Dickinson is a master at paying attention to her world and finding the smallest details. Mary Oliver would walk every morning, and I can imagine Emily Dickinson walking through the fields around her home. And although she didn't ever leave that home, her father's home, very often, she found the world in the small details that surrounded her. So Mary Oliver writes a poem called The Summer Day. And I want to give you just the last part of that poem called The Summer Day. And if you love poetry, please go and read more of Mary Oliver. And she says this, I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I do know how to pay attention, how to fall down into the grass, how to kneel down in the grass, how to be idled and blessed, how to stroll through the fields, which is what I've been doing all day. Tell me, what else should I have done? Doesn't everything die at last, and too soon? Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? Doesn't everything die, and too soon? Tell me, what is it that you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? And Emily Dickinson, with her one wild and precious life, paid attention and wrote poetry. We know that she wrote about 1,175 poems that have been captured. There may be many that have been lost. I know for my own poetry, it's not always caught. And so I'm sure that there probably are more poems that maybe one day will be discovered. But Mary Oliver walks. Emily Dickinson walks and pays attention to the world. And so Dickinson's poems call us to pay attention, just like another modern poet, the Canadian Rupi Kaur. And she writes poems a little bit like Emily Dickinson. Some of them are just incredibly short. And listen to the similarity in theme on this one. Like Dickinson, she doesn't title them. The first line of the poem very often becomes the title. And Rupi Kaur says this, you ask if we can still be friends. I explain how a honeybee does not dream of kissing the mouth of a flower and then settle for its leaves. I don't need more friends. And so in that brevity, in that microscope, she begins to find the world. Dying just before Emily Dickinson was born was the great poet William Blake. And I'm sure that she would have been familiar with his poetry. And William Blake, in one of his famous lines, talks about to see the world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower. Hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. And those are themes that reflect in Dickinson's poetry as she reduces the world to the tiniest grain of sand, and yet in that grain of sand she is able to see an eternity. Dickinson, a bit like the modern writer Margaret Atwood, wrote all the time, prolifically. Margaret Atwood says, if I didn't have paper, I would write on my skin. And Emily Dickinson writes on everything that she can find. She writes on envelopes, scraps of paper, chocolate wrappers. Because remember, in those days and where she was living, Paper was quite a luxury. She wouldn't have been able to pop down to the local P&A and buy herself an exam pad. Paper was a precious commodity, and she used every scrap of paper that she could. She wrote mostly in seclusion, at night in her room, but her cousin is said to have heard her singing and chanting her poems as she skimmed the milk, helping with the work in her father's home. And I wonder if she would have been singing or chanting one of these poems. And what I love about Emily Dickinson is her poetry can go into something as tiny as this. But the concentration in the poems is intense. It's easier to write a long poem than a short one. I think it was Winston Churchill who famously said, "I would have written you a shorter letter, but I didn't have the time." And so in poetry, it's that ability to condense meaning in a very powerful way into as few words as possible and still give the reader a picture of the world in a grain of sand. And I wonder if this was one of the poems. It's all I have to bring today, this and my heart beside, this and my heart and all the fields and all the meadows wide. Be sure you count, should I forget, someone could tell, this and my heart and all the bees which in the clover dwell. Everything needs to be counted, every single bee to be counted in that world. It's interesting to note that Emily Dickinson, as a young girl, was a very keen botanist. And you can see that in her poetry. She created a book of pressed flowers. She labeled them all in Latin. But her poems are like a microscope that look at the tiny moments of the world and the bigger moments and movements of the world, like in The Wind Begun to Rock. But she has that attention, that devotion to detail that marks the best of poets. She was not recognized in her lifetime, and there's almost a plaintive tone in this little poem where she says, "This is my letter to the world that never wrote to me, the simple news that nature told with tender majesty. Her message is committed to hands I cannot see, for love of her sweet countrymen, judge tenderly of me." And so she asks us, the people of her time and those of us now reading her poetry, how could she have imagined from that tiny village, writing on scraps of paper, getting a few poems published, most of them anonymous, some of them published without her permission, those 10 poems, that she could become the second most influential American poet. See, we never know what develops from our strange passions, and we should always follow them. This is my letter to the world that never wrote to me. Write your letters to the world, and perhaps you will find something amazing coming back. Emily Dickinson also tells us that hope is the thing with feathers. Isn't that beautiful? The idea that a bird is hope because it can fly and lift itself. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. How beautiful to know, when you look next at a bird, that hope is a thing with feathers, and it sings and never stops at all. So how does that bring us then to The Wind Begun to Rock the Grass? It's a different sort of poem for Emily Dickinson. She was criticized in her time from the poems that were seen because she was a rebel. Many poets are. She broke the form. Think of E. E. Cummings Dylan Thomas, who broke the form so that people after them could follow the rules of the new form. And so, in her rebel way, writing with indashes, with punctuation, um, with musical tones reminding us of the Psalms, she creates her own rhythm and song. And I think one of the other interesting things about a good poet is that the poet listens to the music of the poem in their head. And if the music, well, let me speak about myself. If the music of the poem doesn't work, it can't be written. It must have its own rhythm. It must flow on the page like a song. Think of your favorite song and how those words just flow and take you to a different place. And I think in The Wind Begun to Rock, Emily Dickinson really allows that beautiful lyrical flow of her words to come through as she sees a world in its dual nature, a world that is about to be beset by an enormous storm, but also a world of tremendous beauty, and that the world and we as part of it are the human beings that we are. We have this dual nature. She does say, when she's asked why does she live where she is and who does she have for company? And she says this, she says, I have hills, sir, and a sundown, and a dog large as myself, bought for me by my father. They are better than beings, because they do not tell. They do not tell. I am nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there's a pair of us. That's another of Emily Dickinson's very famous short poems. But she does tell, and she tells through the force of nature. And she makes nature the powerful person. Look at the personification that's used in the poem. The power is in the natural. Other things scurry away. Other things just escape the certainty of death by the end of the poem. The lightning strikes a tree, but it could just as easily have hit her father's house and her within it. The wind begun to rock the grass with threatening tunes, and lo, he flung a menace at the earth, a menace at the sky. The leaves unhooked themselves from trees and started all abroad. The dust did scoop itself like hands and throw away the road. The wagons quickened on the streets, the thunder hurried slow, the lightning showed a yellow beak, and then a livid claw. The birds put up the bars to nests, the cattle fled to barns. There came one drop of giant rain, and then, as if the hands that held the dams had parted hold, the waters wrecked the sky, but overlooked my father's house, just quartering a tree. Look at the way that she introduces, it's almost as if nature is bringing to life the storm. The wind begun to rock the grass, and you can hear that lullaby almost in that as the wind begins to bring the storm to life with threatening tunes, and lo, an unusual lullaby. We wouldn't normally sing a threatening lullaby. And then that power, he flung a menace at the earth. We can see the lightning crashing down, but at the same time a menace at the sky. And so the whole world, earth and sky and everything between, is caught in this moment as the storm begins to build. Look at the deliberateness of the leaves unhooked themselves from trees, almost as if they have chosen to go. They cannot resist the power of the wind. Perhaps they want to fly away on a glorious flight, but they unhook themselves from the trees. The tree doesn't drop them. And started all abroad, they travel, they move away from the tree. Everything has the potential in nature to change and to move. Life and death must come. The dust is seen to scoop itself up, scoop itself like hands. Isn't that just the most amazing image? As you see the wind coming and it scoops the dust up and then throws away the road which is the human invention that people must travel on, and nature just takes it right away, flattens it out, and reasserts its power in this moment. The wagons quickened on the streets, and you can see the leaves unhooked and free, but people in the wagons hurrying home to get away from this storm. The thunder hurried slow. It knows its power. It's almost as if you can imagine a lion or a big cat just stalking behind the people in the wagons, just looking at them and saying, okay, I'm coming for you, but in my own time. The thunder hurried slow. That's an oxymoron, isn't it? Because you can't hurry slow, but you can see the people hurrying in front of the storm as it makes its slow way towards them. Lovely metaphor for the lightning. The lightning showed a yellow beak, and I get the image of a bird of prey and that yellow beak just coming through. But it's beautiful. And then the beak emerges into a livid claw, and you can see that bright, livid flash of lightning and that claw as the lightning streaks across the sky and holds the world in its grip. The world in a grain of sand, in a livid claw held in its grip. The birds put up the bars to nests. And so they keep themselves safe where the leaves have unhooked. The birds put up their bars to nests. The cattle fled to barns. So those things that can go away, go. And then look what takes us to the height of the storm. It's not the lightning. It's not the thunder. It is, under the microscope, just one drop of rain. There came one drop of giant rain. And you heard that rain. Can you think of it when you hear that first plop of rain? You just know that first big plop of rain is going to bring an enormous storm, but it starts with the one drop. And then, as if the hands, and we go back to the hands that scooped the sand and the road and threw it away, and look how the lines rush like a river through these last two stanzas. Look how that run-on line takes us through, and then as if the hands that held the dams had parted hold. The dams are also man-made, possibly, but even the dams have been separated, and so there is water from the sky, almost as if there is a flood of dams unleashed upon the land. The waters wrecked the sky. Now think about that. That's interesting, because wouldn't the sky be delivering the water? But she turns it upside down in the same way that she does in that first stanza, where heaven, sky, everything is mixed up. And so in this storm, it's the waters that wreck the sky, and those lovely W sounds that actually, even though this is a quick line, the W sound stretches it out. You can't say that quickly. If you're writing a poem and you want to slow things down, W's and L's are very good for doing that. But overlooked my father's house. It's quite odd at the end of this, because she's painted the picture of this enormous storm, but it's as if some divine moment has intervened, and it just kind of overlooks that storm that was hurrying slow behind the wagons, the birds putting up their bars, the cattle fleeing into the barns. Yet she says, my father's house, and she distances herself. She doesn't put herself in the house. It overlooked my father's house, and the end of the poem comes almost as an anticlimax, and it just quarters a tree. But quarter also makes me think of hung, drawn, and quartered, where people were cut down the middle, quartered, and their insides taken out. And this storm, it's almost as if it's turned the world upside down, taken the insides out. But she is safe in the house, and it just quarters the tree. But the birds have made their bars, the leaves have unhooked. And there is at the end of this poem a tremendous sense of the fragility of life. That in just a moment, a flash of lightning, we can be taken away. And Emily Dickinson writes a lot about life and a lot about death. And I'm going to try and find a little poem quickly that I wasn't going to use for you, but it's this one. And I wonder if Auden wasn't thinking about this poem when he wrote Funeral Blues. And it's another very short poem, and she says, "The bustle in a house the morning after death is solemnest of industries enacted upon earth, the sweeping up the heart and putting love away, we shall not want to use again until eternity." The sweeping up the heart and putting love away. For Emily Dickinson, it was suspected that she had a couple of affairs. There was some speculation that she was in love with her sister-in-law, but there's no certainty around that. But there is certainty in this, that Emily Dickinson was a prolific and magnificent poet, unrecognized in her time, possibly unrecognized in some areas now, but leaves a tapestry of poems by which we can guide ourselves. And she herself, by the way, tried to self-publish. She put together a series of 4 pages all folded over and she didn't have a punch, made little crude holes in them and tied them together with thread and kept these little books of her poems. She was desperate to get the poetry out of her heart. And if you're a creative person, you will know how a poem, a dance, a song, a painting can lodge in your heart until it flies free, until, like the leaves, it unhooks itself from the trees and started all abroad, like Emily Dickinson's poems, to land in this moment as you are listening to me here in your life. And I hope that as you listen, you will go remembering attention is devotion. Pay attention to the world. See the world. Really see it. Attention is devotion. Pay attention. And keep above you all the time when you next see a bird, hope is the thing with feathers. Thank you.